Namaskar. A very good evening to all of you. On behalf of the Vivekananda Study Circle, Jawaharlal Nehru University, we welcome our speakers, delegates, and dear friends to this virtual meeting for the panel discussion on Swami Vivekananda and religious pluralism. We start today's program with a recital of Vedic chanting from Taittiriya Upanishad, a part of Yajurveda. I request Professor Anirban Chakrabarti and Mrs. Anindita Mukherjee to recite the mantra, please.
Sahana bhavatu Sahano bhunaktu Sahaviryam karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai Om Shanti 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 Om. May we all be protected. May we all be nourished. May we work together with great energy. May our intellect be sharpened. Let there be no animosity amongst us. Om. Peace in me, peace in nature, peace in divine forces.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Before proceeding, I would like to give you a brief introduction to Vivekananda Study Circle, JNU. VSC JNU was formed on November 1st, 2014 to study the Vedanta philosophy with the aim of molding our lives based on the Vedantic truth of oneness. VSC JNU is a non-political, non-religious, non-profitable, independent organization run by faculty members, students, and alumni of JNU. We conduct regular meetings on every Saturday to study the scriptures and works of Swamiji. We also practice chanting and meditation. We regularly organize cultural events, public talks, and retreat programs. The overall aim of VSC is practicing the awareness and application of spiritual principles to train our minds, strengthening our ability to direct our attention in ways that enhance our learning, growth, and healing. So this was about VSC JNU. Now I request Professor Anirban Chakrabarti to introduce the topic of today's discussion. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Amrita. So today's topic is Swami Vivekananda and religious pluralism. Religious pluralism is an approach that values and encourages diversity of religious expression and culminates harmony, convergence, or compatibility across religious traditions in opposition to religious exclusivism. In the late 19th century, Swami Vivekananda emerged as the symbol of reasoned tolerance and pluralism. His doctrine of religious pluralism can be traced from a hymn and a quotation from Bhagavad Gita, which he quoted at the World's Parliament of Religion on 11th September 1893. The words of that hymn are Ruchi nang vaichitrad rijukutila nana pathajushan Rinameko gamya Stamasi payasamarnavaiva. As the different streams having their sources in different places, all mingle their water in the sea, so, O Lord, the different paths which men take through different tendencies, various though they appear, crooked or straight, all lead to thee. Swamiji symbolized the religious pluralism with different paths leading to the same destination, that is, realization of God in every soul. And this realization is the key that enables humanity to recognize divinity in every man and woman. Thank you, Amrita. I now request Dr. Arpita Bitra to chair the session and conduct the panel discussion.
Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
So good evening and thank you for joining us today for a discussion on a very important subject. We live today in a post-secular world where we are acknowledging once again the power of religion. Religious pluralism is an idea that was formalized in the Christian world only from the 1960s and especially the 1970s onwards, whereas it existed in practice in Indian society from very early on, as there existed many paths to the ultimate truth. Following his Guru Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda was one of the greatest and also one of the earliest champions of the harmony of religions in modern times, way before the West even thought about religious pluralism seriously. Without wasting more time, I'll introduce our speakers today. I extend a warm welcome to both our speakers, Professor Jeffery Long, who has joined us from Pennsylvania, and Swami Medhananda ji, who has joined us from Belur Math. Professor Long is a professor of Religion and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College, Pennsylvania, USA. He is the author of A Vision for Hinduism, Jainism an Introduction, and the Historical Dictionary of Hinduism. He is the co-editor of the Buddhism and Jainism sections of the Springer Encyclopedia of Indian Religions and the editor of the volume Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific. Swami Medhananda is a monk of the Ramakrishna Order, assistant professor and head of the program in philosophy at Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in Belur Math. He is the author of the book Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. He's also the editor of the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta and the editor of a forthcoming special issue on Vedantic theodicies for the International Journal of Hindu Studies. He has recently completed a book manuscript, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. So today we have two of the best experts on the subject with us. A warm welcome to both of you once again. Each speaker has 15 minutes. I request the audience, if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat box during the talk. Live questions will be taken up after the speakers have finished speaking. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Namaste. Namaskar, everyone. And I hope I'm audible also. Looks like it. Okay, very good. So first of all, I'm just very grateful to be here and to be invited and to be in such excellent company. Thank you so much. It's really a privilege to be co-speaking with Swami Medhananda. We have been friends for quite some time, for a long time by email. We're very like-minded when it comes to this topic. So we've agreed on somewhat of a division of labor for today. I will speak less on Swamiji himself and more on categories that have been developed for having this conversation about religious pluralism and some of the implications of those categories, which Swami Medhananda will then be utilizing and as he presents his recent work on Swamiji. I do want to share just a quick personal anecdote about Swami Medhananda. The one time we actually met in person was at the American Academy of Religion meeting in Denver, Colorado, a couple of years ago. We met in the lobby of the convention center, and we immediately launched into an in-depth conversation I think we'd both been wanting to have for some time about Swami Vivekananda, about Thakur, about religious pluralism, about Immanuel Kant, about various professors that we know who are involved in this field. And this was in the lobby. There were other people sitting around nearby, and some way into our conversation, a gentleman who had been sitting near us stood up and said, I just want to tell you both that listening to your conversation for the last 90 minutes has been the best part of this conference. So we both felt very good. Someone benefited from our conversation. But turning to our topic for today on religious pluralism, in the introduction, in fact, a couple of important points have already been made. This conversation about religious pluralism and the extensive use of this term is something that comes out of Western philosophy and Western philosophy of religion specifically, but is a relatively recent development. And it is something that really comes out of two, I would say, major influences. If we go back to, of course, the late 19th, early 20th century, there is Swamiji himself. And so in my presentation today, I'm going to sort of start with Swamiji and end with Swamiji, where we're going to come full circle. Swamiji, Swami Vivekananda, of course, came to the Western world, spoke at the Parliament of World Religions, established the Vedanta societies, and thereby made a very profound mark on Western culture and on America in particular. In fact, I've just published a book on Hinduism in America, and in my research, what I found is that in its early years, the Vedanta societies established by Swami Vivekananda and many of his brother monks from India attracted a number of very profound intellectuals, people with a lot of ability to sway the larger culture, literary figures, philosophers, scholars of religion. You've probably all heard names like Christopher Isherwood, Aldous Huxley, Joseph Campbell, Houston Smith. These are all people who, to varying degrees, had some affiliation or connection with the Vedanta Society. And through their work, many of the ideas of Vedanta, as taught by Swami Vivekananda, percolated into the wider culture and came to be taken more seriously, to the point where certain ideas and attitudes connected with Vedanta, such as religious pluralism, have now become fairly mainstream in American society, even as the average American really does not have any concept of Vedanta or of this tradition. But the influence it has had, nevertheless, on the larger culture has been quite profound. And in one of those areas of influence is in academia and in the philosophy of religion. Another important source of influence, or another important event, I would say, after the coming of Swamiji, was really two events happening in tandem. There was the Second World War, of course, accompanied by the Holocaust, and there was the decolonization of much of the world. Much of the world had come under the sway of course, the British Empire, the French, various other European powers had colonies, and a consciousness began to emerge that this colonization of societies was really incompatible both with democratic ideals, but also with some of the core teachings of Christianity. Christianity had been one of the justifications for colonization, missionary activity, spreading the word, spreading what was perceived to be a superior civilization. And then the realization with World War II and the Holocaust and the atomic bomb that maybe Western culture was not so superior after all. And many skeptics began to emerge within the West of the concept of Western superiority. And so you see this also influencing Christian theology and philosophy of religion. One of several very prominent figures to represent this movement of questioning of Christian superiority was a philosopher of religion named John Hick, who passed away just a few years ago. I did have the privilege of meeting him when I was in graduate school at Chicago. He came to give a presentation, and I was already a big fan of his work at that point. And I asked my advisor, Paul Griffiths, is there any way I can spend more time with Professor Hick? And he suggested I offer him a ride to the airport, which I did. So we spent about an hour and a half in my car talking about religious pluralism. So he was a big influence on my thinking on these topics. And as Swami Medhananda has shown in his recent work, John Hick was influenced, particularly at an early phase in his career, by Swamiji's thought, not so much directly, but by way of Sri Aurobindo. And John Hick was quite an earnest student of Sri Aurobindo's works. He was also very familiar with Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan's works. And so through these two conduits, many of the ideas of Swami Vivekananda came to influence Hick. He eventually articulated his pluralism in a somewhat different way, which is somewhat problematic. It's a topic we might be able to get back to at a later point. But nevertheless, he was an important figure, a groundbreaking figure in getting Western philosophers of religion and Christian theologians to begin to set aside many of the older attitudes of superiority that had pervaded Christianity for such a long time. So in the midst of this conversation around 1980 or so, a theologian named Alan Race articulated a threefold typology, a set of three categories for describing attitudes that a religious person might have toward religious diversity. And this typology is my main focus today. And it's something that has become standard in the discipline of philosophy of religion whenever we talk about religious diversity. But it's also something that has become problematized in recent years, particularly when we look at figures like Swami Vivekananda or Sri Ramakrishna. We find there are places where this threefold typology breaks down a little bit. It's sometimes difficult to fit a specific thinker into the mold of one of these three types. So this typology has been refined somewhat over the years, and we're continuing to refine it today. So that's what I want to turn to now. So in Alan Race's threefold typology, he describes three basic types of attitude that a religious person might take, a stance that a religious person might take toward religious diversity. The first one, given that it was the oldest one in the Western tradition, is called exclusivism. And in the introduction, we heard mention of exclusivism. And the term itself gives a pretty good sense of what exclusivism means. It excludes all traditions other than one's own from the ideas of ultimate truth and also salvation, or we might say liberation if we're talking in more of an Indic context. But according to exclusivism, there is one true religion, which is the one valid path to our ultimate goal, however that ultimate goal might be conceived in the religion. So Christians would say salvation, other traditions might say liberation, we might have many other terms, but whatever that ultimate goal is. And because it was mostly Christian philosophers of religion defining the conversation, the term salvation has become sort of standard as a kind of interreligious term, just referring to whatever the ultimate goal might be. So exclusivism says, my religion alone is true, my religion alone leads to salvation, everyone else is wrong. And there are still many people in various religious traditions who hold this view, but it came in for heavy critique in the 60s and 70s especially, because of the many negative outcomes it was seen to produce. The whole missionary enterprise and the colonialism that accompanies it, the attitude of superiority of one culture towards another, all of these things are sort of fueled, one could argue, by this theological belief that only my religion is true and only my religion can save you. And so that's exclusivism. A somewhat modulated or toned down version of this, you could say, or maybe a completely new position, depending on how you look at it, is inclusivism, which is the second category. And inclusivism, I think, is one of the most, maybe the most interesting of the three, because of its sort of position as a middle view between exclusivism and then what would emerge as pluralism. Inclusivism is the view that there is one, one might say, one fully true religion or truest religion, one religion in terms of which truth is to be measured, and one religion that is, one could say, the proper location of salvation. But inclusivism, unlike exclusivism, opens up the idea that there may also be truth in many religions, and it is possible for people practicing many religions to attain salvation. The classic expression of this in the Western tradition is in the teaching of the Catholic Church in the Second Vatican Council, based on the theology of Karl Rahner, who taught that he was trying to maintain two essential Christian teachings at the same time. One is that God desires the salvation of all, and the second is the necessity of Christ for salvation. Now, of course, in exclusivism, the emphasis is on the necessity of Christ for salvation, and if you don't accept that, then you're probably not saved in most models of exclusivism. But Rahner said, no, God wants to save everyone, and so salvation through Christ becomes available to people in their religious practice and their religious understanding. And so he coined this term anonymous Christians to describe all of the good people of all religions who are going to be saved but don't openly or explicitly profess Christianity. Then finally we come to pluralism. And again, Hick was really the pioneer of this position, which argues that inclusivism does not go far enough, that inclusivism shares with exclusivism a certain parochial worldview. And Hick compares the shift from exclusivism and inclusivism to pluralism to the shift in astronomy from the Ptolemaic worldview, where the Earth was the center of the solar system, to the Copernican worldview, where we realize that Earth is just one more planet orbiting the sun. So in the same way, Hick says we should realize that all religions have some truth and some falsehood. All religions are locations where salvation can occur, because one sees saintly good people being produced in many different religious traditions. And therefore, rather like the planets orbiting the sun, we should see all religions as somewhere in proximate relation to an ultimate truth that is really beyond all of them. And this is his model of pluralism, which has been quite predominant, quite strong. Now, as I said before, this threefold model has become standard, but it's also come under some criticism because it fails to make certain differentiations. So some scholars have suggested refinements of this model. Two particular things I want to point out in the 1 or 2 minutes I have remaining. First of all, the threefold model in its original form combines truth and salvation, right? We've been talking about truth and salvation, truth and salvation. But in fact, and I suspect Swami Medhananda is going to speak about this on his work on Swami Vivekananda, one needs to differentiate the question of truth from the question of salvation. So, for example, this really becomes pertinent with regard to inclusivism, one can certainly believe that one's own religion has truths that are not present in others. And in fact, one could argue, and I have argued this, that part of having a religious commitment is the belief that this particular religion has something that other religions don't have. Otherwise, why would one adhere to it, right? Of course, we typically adhere to a religion by the accident of birth. But if, as has been my case, we find that another tradition, for me it was Vedanta and Hinduism, if we find it has answers and that it has a certain logic that we don't find as much in the tradition we were born into, then we shift to that because we think, well, no, that really has something that others don't. That can be distinguished from the question of salvation. So, for example, as Swami Medhananda has argued in his book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna had a definite worldview. He believed, for example, in rebirth. He held a worldview that was, in many respects, we could say a basic Hindu worldview. But part of that worldview was believing that many religions, many paths could lead to salvation. And in fact, he experienced this directly through his multi-faith sadhanas, which he experienced. So you could be an inclusivist with regard to truth, but a pluralist with regard to salvation. And in fact, this seems to be, I think, the view of both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda to some extent. So you can't describe someone as purely inclusivist or purely pluralist. People are, they may be one thing in regard, they may be one thing in regard to truth and something else in regard to salvation. With regard to inclusivism specifically, the inclusivist view can be further differentiated. My former teacher, Paul Griffiths, wrote a wonderful book about this, Problems of Religious Diversity, and he suggests further refinement of the threefold typology. He says there can be an open inclusivism or a closed inclusivism. That is, if inclusivism is the view that there is one tradition that is the most true, speaking now with regard to truth, that can either mean that that religion is most true, but it nevertheless may be lacking certain truths that are found in others. And so therefore there's a motivation to engage in interfaith dialogue and learn from other traditions and expand one's store of truth. Or it could be a closed inclusivism, which means you believe that really everything that is of importance is already found in your tradition. And yes, there may be truth in other traditions, but it's not particularly urgent that one find it because it's already present in one's own. So you could see sort of a scale where you have exclusivism, closed inclusivism, open inclusivism, then finally pluralism. Finally, one last refinement I would like to suggest, and this is something I've been thinking about in my own work for a while, and particularly as I've been teaching this material for the last few years, we can also differentiate, besides truth and salvation, we could also talk about exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism in socio-political terms. That is, exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism vis-a-vis how we treat other human beings from different religious communities. So someone might have, for example, a pluralistic theology, believing that many religions are valid ways to salvation and that many religions contain truth, but one might, on a socio-political level, be exclusivist towards maybe members of communities that have exclusivist theologies. And in fact, this is even a debate that has occurred within the realm of Western philosophy of religion, because more traditionalist, more exclusivist and inclusivist theologians have sometimes objected that pluralists, while they're talking about universal truth and salvation, are in a sense forming their own elite club within the philosophy of religion. Well, we're the enlightened people that see truth everywhere, unlike those old-fashioned exclusivists. So one can be exclusivist on a socio-political level, even if one is being pluralist in the theological realm. So there may be yet further refinements of this threefold typology that emerge as the conversation unfolds. But as I said, coming back full circle to Swami Vivekananda and hopefully setting it up well for Swami Medhananda's presentation, one finds this threefold typology does need refinement if we're going to really understand Swami Vivekananda. I think someone needs to mute their
please mute your mic.
Yeah. So
Sir,
I'm just
mute his mic?
Yeah, just finishing up. So if we're going to understand Swami Vivekananda's religious pluralism, we need to refine this threefold typology and see how it applies in different ways to Swamiji's thought and also to his thought at different times in his career. So I think I've gone slightly over time, so I'd like to hand it off to my good friend and colleague, Swami Medhananda.
Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. I'm very grateful to the organizers for having me today, and I'm honored to be speaking alongside Professor Jeffery Long, a good friend of mine. And my pranams to Swami Nitya Satyananda. I can see him on the screen, and any other Maharajas who are present today. So I'm also grateful to Professor Long for setting up my own lecture, because he did a wonderful job of kind of setting up this typology. And I'm going to use that now to discuss Swami Vivekananda's views in a bit of detail. What I'll be doing in the next 15 minutes is giving a very, very bare bones summary of section 3 of an article of mine that was recently published. The article is called, "Was Swami Vivekananda a Hindu Supremacist? Revisiting a Long-Standing Debate." It was just published in the journal called Religions, just like a month ago. So there are a lot of nuances in that article, which I'm just going to omit, because in 15 minutes in a lecture, I'm not going to be able to cover that. So let's start off where Professor Long left off. He mentioned that there are two basic paradigms for cashing out the threefold typology. One is in terms of truth, the truth of religious doctrines. The other is in terms of salvation. And in my in the article version of my argument, I discuss both, but I don't have the time now, and I want to do justice to one of the two at least. So what I'll be doing today in the next few minutes is just focusing on the typology in terms of salvation, okay? So what that means is, there are two basic positions here with respect to Vivekananda. The vast majority of scholars, and I can just mention a few names. One of the most famous and one of the earliest was Paul Hacker. He was a German scholar. Wilhelm Halbfass, he was a disciple, he was mentored by Paul Hacker. And then more recently, a book was published just last year by a scholar named Stephen Gregg, and a number of others. What they all claim is that Swami Vivekananda, even though he preached the harmony of religions, he was actually a covert religious inclusivist. Covert or overt is a controversial question, but what they claim is that, look, if you analyze what Swami Vivekananda is teaching really closely, what you'll find is that he's always putting Advaita Vedanta on a higher level. He always gives a higher status to Advaita Vedanta than to any other religion, whether it's Christianity or Islam, or even theistic strands of Hinduism itself, Vaishnavism, Shaktism, and other things. And when he does that, he seems to be lapsing into more of an inclusivist position than a pluralist position, right? Because as Professor Long pointed out, salvific inclusivism is the position that only one religion is most effective in leading to salvation. Other religions aren't completely hopeless, but they're inferior in some way. So they might take you part of the way, but they can't take you all the way, or they're not as good at effecting salvation. So that's what the vast majority of scholars say, and I just want to make a brief case here, and if you're interested in the details, you can look at my article. What I want to argue is that what scholars have missed is that, in my view, Swami Vivekananda's views on religious diversity actually evolved from 1894 to 1895. And I think most people have missed this, what this evolution consists in. So I'm going to just briefly try to explain what I see the change as being. So I'm going to focus on just two phases in the evolution. So in the first phase, I characterize this phase as from 1894 to May 1895. It's less than a year. It's about 9 or 10 months. What I find is that Swami Vivekananda was only an inclusivist, an Advaitic inclusivist, for that brief time period of about 9 months, from September 1894 to May 1895. And as far as I can tell, I've done quite a bit of research on this, and part of the problem is that the complete works itself is non-chronological, so you can't track the evolution in Swami Vivekananda's ideas. Fortunately, two intrepid devotees of the Portland Ashrama in the US, they compiled an extensive and rigorous list of a chronological listing of Swami Vivekananda's lectures, starting from 1893 going up to 1901. So I made copious use of that list, and you can find it online through the Vedanta Hollywood website, I believe. So what I found is that there are only 4 texts where Swami Vivekananda upholds an inclusivist position, an Advaitic inclusivism. You can find the details in my article, but I'll just mention them quickly. The reply to the Madras Address, which he wrote in September 1894, his lecture, The Religions of India, delivered on 30th December 1894, his lecture, Soul, God, and Religion, delivered on 8th March 1895, and finally, in a letter to his disciple, Arasinga Perumal, that letter is dated 6th May 1895. And to my mind, this is the last instance, the 6th May letter, 1895, when he actually subscribes to an Advaitic inclusivist position. And I'll just read the relevant passage from that letter. This is from the 6th May 1895 letter to Alasingha. Swami Vivekananda says, all of religion is contained in the Vedanta. That is, in the 3 stages of the Vedanta philosophy, the Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Advaita. One comes after the other. These are the 3 stages of spiritual growth in man. Each one is necessary. This is the essential of religion. The Vedanta, applied to the various ethnic customs and creeds of India, is Hinduism. The first stage, i.e. Dvaita, applied to the ideas of the ethnic groups of Europe, is Christianity. As applied to the Semitic groups, Mohammedanism. By Mohammedanism, he means Islam. The Advaita, as applied in its yoga perception form, is Buddhism, etc. End quote. So in this passage, I think all these scholars who criticize Vivekananda for being more of an inclusivist than a pluralist, I think they're justified in thinking that he was an inclusivist, because I think this kind of passage is pretty clearly inclusivist. Why is it inclusivist? Because he's claiming that every single religious practitioner, whether you're Christian or Muslim or a Vaishnava, etc., you ultimately, you can't attain salvation directly. It'll take you part of the way. Your religion will take you part of the way. Ultimately, you have to practice Advaita Vedanta, because he says each stage is necessary. Did you notice that there's one sentence where he says each stage is necessary? That means it's not optional. You have to eventually attain the Advaitic realization. So it's kind of mandatory. And the highest goal is Advaita Vedanta. And notice that he aligns Christianity and Islam with the Dvaita phase. That's the lowest of the 3 stages, right? So I think if, you know, what a lot of scholars do is they point to passages like this and say, see, he was an inclusivist. What I think they're missing is that that was what I see as his early view. And that most scholars have missed how his view evolves after May 1895. So let me just discuss briefly now the second phase, what I consider the second phase. From late 1895 to 1901, so that's for the rest of his life. He held, this is what I consider to be his mature position on religious diversity. And I want to argue that it's a full-blown religious pluralist position. And whereas with the previous phase, I could name the 4 texts. In this second phase, there's a massive number of texts. And if you want the details, you can look at footnote 18 of page 9 of my article. I'm not going to list them now. That would take 15 minutes just by itself. But there's a huge number of lectures between late 1895 and 1901 where he's consistently subscribing to a pluralist position rather than his earlier inclusivist position. And I'll give just a brief selection of evidence to try to substantiate that point. So what is Swami Vivekananda's mature religious pluralist position? I want to argue that what he does starting in late 1895 is he reconceptualizes religious diversity in terms of his framework, the Vedantic framework of the 4 yogas, rather than in terms of the 3 stages of Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Advaita. What are the 4 yogas? Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Raja Yoga, otherwise known as Dhyana Yoga. These are the 4 yogas. And his argument proceeds in 3 steps. First step, he claims that every world religion corresponds to one of the 4 yogas. He says this, for instance, in his 1896 lecture on Sri Ramakrishna. It's incorrectly titled My Master in Complete Works. The original title is actually Sri Ramakrishna. I'll just quote the one relevant sentence here. Swami Vivekananda says, a man may be intellectual, that's Jnana Yoga, or devotional, that's Bhakti Yoga, or mystic, that's Raja Yoga, or active, that's Karma Yoga. The various religions represent one or the other of these types, end quote. So he says it very clearly that what he tries to do is he maps the different world religions onto one or more of the 4 yogas. Now, how does he arrive at religious pluralism? Let's look at the next 2 steps. Second step, he claims in many places, each of the 4 yogas is equally effective in leading to salvation. He says this, for instance, in his 1896 Karma Yoga lecture, and I'll read the relevant sentences. He says, each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, of wisdom, and of devotion are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha. He says extremely clearly, and unlike, so here he's deviating from Shankaracharya, who says that Jnana Yoga is the only direct and independent path to salvation. He's also deviating from Ramanuja, who says that Bhakti Yoga is the only direct and independent path to salvation. What he's doing is he's following Sri Ramakrishna, rather than the traditional Vedanta commentators, in claiming that all four of the yogas can take you directly to the highest goal of God realization. Now, these are the two main premises. What follows from these premises logically? Step 3. He says, it follows that all of the world religions are equally effective in leading to salvation, right? This follows directly. If each religion corresponds to one of the 4 yogas and each of the yogas leads directly to salvation, then each of the world religions also leads directly to salvation. They're equally fitted to lead to salvation. They're on an equal footing. And that's, by definition, a salvific pluralist position. Now, the next question is, what is this goal of all religions that Sri Ramakrishna talks about, that Swami Vivekananda talks about? And here, there are some nuances that we have to bring in. Normally, especially these traditional Vedanta commentators, they tend to have a narrow understanding of the goal of religion. So if you're a theistic religious practitioner, whether you're Ramanuja or a Christian or a Muslim, they'll tend to understand salvation in theistic terms as a kind of eternal loving communion with the personal God, typically. Advaitins will have an equally narrow view of salvation, but it's very different. It's a very different picture of salvation. What Advaitins say is, no. Salvation is not about, dwelling in some loka with a personal God. That's all lower stuff. True salvation is like what Sri Ramakrishna says about the salt doll melting into the ocean. You merge your identity, your individuality in the impersonal, non-dual Brahman. And the only reality is that Brahman. So you become the ultimate reality. There's no longer any individuality. There's no dualism between the jiva, the soul, and God. Okay? Now, what I think Swami Vivekananda is doing, again, in the spirit of his guru Sri Ramakrishna, is he's expanding the conception of salvation. So how he does this is he's understanding God in a much broader way than these traditional commentators. So, for instance, Swami Vivekananda says, in one place, he says, our religion teaches an impersonal, personal God, he says in one place. So, and Sri Ramakrishna says the same thing in different words, where he says, Brahma or Shakti Abhed in Bangla, which means Brahman, by which he means this impersonal, non-dual Brahman, is one and the same reality as Shakti, by which he means the personal, dynamic God, which creates this universe. So I think Vivekananda holds the same position. Because he does, he's able to accommodate multiple forms of salvation and put them on an equal footing. So what he's doing is he's saying that the bhakta who wants to remain in eternal communion with the personal God can do that, and that's salvation for him. But an Advaita Vedantin or some forms of Buddhism, if they want to merge their individuality in non-dual Brahman or to remain in the state of nirvana, so be it, and they can attain that form of salvation. That's salvation for them. But because Vivekananda is working with a very capacious understanding of God and God realization, he's able to put them on an equal footing, which makes him a full-blown religious pluralist. And I just want to end by mentioning one other thing here, which I think is very important. I want to argue that Swami Vivekananda was not just a religious pluralist, but he deepened and radicalized religious pluralism into what I call a religious cosmopolitanism. What is that? Religious cosmopolitanism, on my definition, is that it's something close to what Professor Long was talking about when he was talking about open inclusivism, which is that it provides a rationale for learning from other religions other than our own. So how does he arrive at this religious cosmopolitanism? It's again based on this framework of the 4 yogas. Because what he says is that each of the 4 yogas develops one dimension of the human personality. So, I'll read the quotation because it'll be self-evident. So I'm going to read a passage from his 1896 Lessons on Bhakti Yoga. We want to become harmonious beings with the psychical, spiritual, intellectual, and working active sides of our nature equally developed. The ideal is really that we should become many-sided. We must be as broad as the skies, as deep as the ocean. We must have the zeal of the fanatic, the depth of the mystic, and the width of the agnostic. We must become many-sided. Indeed, we must become protean in character, so as not only to tolerate but to do what is much more difficult, to sympathize, to enter into another's path, and feel with him in his aspirations and seeking after God. So this to me embodies a really robust religious cosmopolitanism. That is, Swami Vivekananda's position is that because each religion teaches us something unique about the nature of God and about different spiritual practices, so that we can always benefit from exposing ourselves to other religious traditions. And I'll just end with another beautiful passage. It's from his 1900 lecture, The Way to the Realization of a Universal Religion. I think this passage is important because he's anticipating a really prominent movement now throughout the world called multiple religious belonging. They're people who belong, they're grounded in their own religious tradition, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, but they freely practice, full-blown practice other religions as well. And he anticipated that entire movement over 100 years ago. This is the passage. Our watchword then will be acceptance and not exclusion. I accept all religions that were in the past and worship with them all. I worship God with every one of them in whatever form they worship him. I shall go to the mosque of the Mohammedan. I shall enter the Christian's church and kneel before the crucifix. I shall enter the Buddhistic temple where I shall take refuge in Buddha and in his law. I shall go into the forest and sit down in meditation with the Hindu, who is trying to see the light which enlightens the heart of everyone. Not only shall I do all these, but I shall keep my heart open for all that may come in the future. We stand in the present, but open ourselves to the infinite future. We take in all that has been in the past, enjoy the light of the present, and open every window of the heart for all that will come in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj, and thank you, Jeffrey, for these excellent lectures today. I'm sure most of the people who are present today have been enlightened, because these things are usually not discussed in the public space in India. And I think I'm yet to come across another religious practitioner who gives as much freedom and liberty in matters of spiritual choices as Swamiji or Sri Ramakrishna. So for us, it is often very shocking that the common academic debate around Swamiji is whether he was a supremacist or not. For everybody's information, I have shared the details of
I think there is some problem with Arpita's connection. Amrita, am I audible? Amrita?
No, I think we have reached the end. We are not able to hear.
Right.
Yes, sir.
We will conduct the question answer session. So I'll let Arpita join, but in the meantime, I can see some questions in the chat box. So the first question comes Mr. Arunoday Sinha, is that how awareness towards religious pluralism can be increased among masses, especially in response to religious dogmatism, which is so easy to grasp. So,
please go ahead, Jeff.
Okay. Maybe we can both speak to it.
So I'm back. I'm sorry, technology just ditched us at the wrong moment. Yeah, please carry on. Yeah.
Okay. So I think certainly one part of the answer to this question is education, and this is in fact is why I went into this field to some extent. That I think we need to incorporate this idea of pluralism into our curriculum as much as possible. Of course, there are issues there. One thing we have in America, of course, separation of church and state. So you can't be seen to be promoting a particular religious position. But, and I'm just thinking out loud here, it seems to me that pluralism is in many ways sort of the next step after secularism. Secularism, of course, it means something different a little bit in America than it does in India. But what the two share is the idea that basically people from different religious communities should all be able to live in the same nation state together without conflict or without religion-based conflict. And at least in its American version, secularism has often taken the shape of an approach that tends to remove religion from the public sphere. And as Arpita said, these conversations don't often happen because when you start talking about truth and salvation, people become extremely uncomfortable because there's this whole history of people trying to persuade one another, sometimes violently, that their way is the right way. At the same time, though, I think secularism in many ways has pushed religion out of the public sphere, and that this has become in many ways toxic for religion. There's a great scholar of religion, Mark Juergensmeyer. He's written a wonderful book about religiously motivated violence, and he shows that there's some kind of religious terrorism that has been carried out in the name of every tradition, practically, at some point or another. And that what the people who turn to violence, what they tend to share, even if their worldviews are very different, is a sense that what they hold to be sacred has been pushed out of society and that it needs to be reasserted violently. My sense about pluralism is if the kind of pluralism that Thakur and Swamiji taught were to be in some way inculcated in our societies, it would serve the goal that secularism was trying to serve in cultivating an environment in which we feel more positively disposed towards one another's traditions. But rather than pushing it out of the public square, it would be very much in the public square. We would be encouraged to pursue the kind of cosmopolitanism that Swami Medhananda is talking about, where we want to learn from one another and see value in one another's traditions. Now, in many ways, maybe I'm not answering the question, I'm just restating the problem. How do we get to that point? And again, I think somehow educating people, and of course we can have webinars and YouTube videos and publish books and articles, that we do whatever is within our capacity. I suppose the last thing I would say about that, which is maybe less of an academic nature, more of a personal, spiritual nature, is that all of us who believe in this live it in our lives, that we not remain silent if our friends say something negative about another tradition, or that we even catch ourselves when we're maybe not being pluralistic in our thinking, and to really study different religions and come to appreciate what is of value, and also be able to think critically. As Thakur said, to separate the sand from the sugar in every tradition. And so I think education and living it out ourselves those are my first inclinations, at least when this question comes up.
Sir, there was a second question in the previous chat box. Can you please read that out? Because my chat box is gone.
Okay, there was a comment or question from Swami Nitya Satyananda. Bishur Maharaj, you want to ask something to Arun Maharaj?
There is a question. There was a question after that, sir.
Yeah, but
yeah.
Bishur Maharaj, if you want to ask question to Arun Maharaj, you can unmute. Oh no, okay, fine. So his thing was he's interested about the article, was Swami Vivekananda Hindu supremacist? So I think we'll get back to that later. There was a question
about different beings, salvation for different beings. There was a question.
Right. Let me just check this. No, that I can't see. I can see one more question.
I'll take up the next questions. Yeah. So whoever asked that, if I remember correctly, the question was, can there be different salvations for different types of beings? I think that was the question.
I can see the question. Gopal Mondal asked, is there any level of salvation for different beings? I think it means beings.
Yeah. So could you please take that up?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what he means, but so I'm not sure what the question is exactly, but if I understand it correctly, it seems that he's asking whether Swami, if he's asking about, doesn't mention Vivekananda, but I assume that he's asking about Vivekananda. He might be asking, does Swami Vivekananda subscribe to the view that there are different levels of salvation for different people? And as I already argued in my presentation, but I make a more developed argument in my article. I think he doesn't have a kind of salvific hierarchy. I think he, as I said in the talk, he puts the theistic form of salvation on an equal footing with the Advaitic form of salvation. But there are other thinkers and other religions which don't do that. And, you know, for instance, Jeffery Long published an article in a fairly recent edited volume on the Nostra Aetate, a very important document written by the Pope several decades ago, where the Pope, the Catholic Pope, says that Catholicism is, what's the metaphor, Jeff? Is it that Catholicism is like the sun, and that every other religion is a kind of ray of that sun? So it's a sort of, it's not wrong, but it's lesser, it's inferior in some way. So the official Catholic position would embody the kind of salvific hierarchy that I think Gopal Mandal is asking about.
Right, because
I might.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry. Please.
Oh, just on the Catholic position, for example, the idea is that people of many, many different religions are achieving salvation, but they're doing so through the grace of God, through Christ, as understood in Catholicism. So it's as if salvation is a universal process, but that the Catholic Church is sort of in on the secret of how it really happens. And that's classic inclusivism, you could say. And again, an analogy can be made with that earlier phase of Swamiji's career where he's affirming Advaitic inclusivism. The Jains have a form of inclusivism. According to traditional Jain teaching, one has to practice Jainism, one has to practice ahimsa as taught in Jainism in order to reach moksha. But because Jains believe in rebirth, they say, well, you know, it could be that everyone will eventually get the chance to do that, right? So it is, again, a kind of inclusivism.
So we can contrast this with a statement from Sri Ramakrishna that everybody thinks that his watch is giving the right time. But if you really want to know the right time, you have to tune your watch with the sun. So this means that these people are arguing about a kind of meta-religion, which is above the religions that we know as. And so this will drag us into a deeper debate. So I just thought I'll mention that. So we'll take up more questions. There's one question from Kanchan Gogate. This is a question to Maharaj. Can you please explain to us the hermeneutics or method of interpretation that you have applied to prove Swamiji's Vedantic cosmopolitanism?
Okay, I mean, again, I would point you to my article. I mean, that's kind of a cop-out because that's where I go into the details. But let me just reiterate what I said in the talk a little bit, which is the logic of the religious cosmopolitanism is that it's on the basis of religious pluralism. So each world religion corresponds to one of the four yogas. Every yoga is a direct and independent path to salvation. Therefore, every world religion is equally effective in leading to the same goal of salvation. Now, that's religious pluralism. How does Swami Vivekananda move from religious pluralism to religious cosmopolitanism? That's the question. Here's how I think he does it. Again, he invokes the four yogas model, but in a different way. He claims that each of the four yogas cultivates a different dimension of the human personality. So Karma Yoga develops the active side of the dynamic side of the human personality. Raja Yoga develops the mystical, meditative side of the personality. Bhakti, the emotional side. Jnana Yoga, the intellectual side. And what Swami Vivekananda urges again and again is that even though each of the four yogas is a direct and independent path, it's preferable. It's more beneficial for us to try to combine the four yogas to the best of our ability. By doing that, we develop a more well-rounded personality and we can make more rapid spiritual progress. And because each of the four yogas corresponds to one of the world religions, what that entails is that we should actively try to learn from and practice religions other than our own. That's the logic in a nutshell.
So there's a second question from Shohini Chatterjee. How can the lost belief in the supreme knowledge in the ancient culture and scriptures be restored among Generation Z so that the four yogas described as paths open up and are believed by the people?
Jeff, go ahead.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question because I think the answers will be different in India than in the United States because in India, at least this concept of the four yogas is present. When I introduce it to my students here in America, it's entirely novel to them. But once they understand it, they realize that these four types of spiritual practice are present. And sometimes I'll have them do an exercise where they sort of try to identify, are they a karma yogi? Are they a jnana yogi? And so on. And typically, most of them end up saying, well, I'm a mix of the four, right? And they might find one or two predominant. And if we think of these in terms of personality types, as Swami Medhananda was just saying, I think that might be a useful tool for explaining this idea outside of India. I think in India, you already have this idea of yoga and yogas in the plural, and it's much easier to grasp. I mean, when I teach people about it here, they think yoga is what you do in a gym, right? It's a completely different sort of orientation. So I think in the different countries, it's going to be different, how this idea is presented.
Do we have any more questions?
Arpita, there is a question.
One question actually. Sorry?
Yes.
No, there is a question from Pradeep Kumar Gautam. He's asking how about Kriya Yoga?
Kriya Yoga. Okay. Is that Colonel Gautam?
So I like that question. How about Kriya Yoga? It's a short question, but it's a very deep question and it's a difficult question. So let me try to unpack that question a bit first, and then I'll try to give an answer from Swami Vivekananda's standpoint. So the question is really interesting. Do Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda put all religions across the board throughout the world on an equal salvific footing or not? And that's a really important question. So is their view that all religions are equally effective in leading to the salvation? The problem with that view, with that position that every religion is equally efficacious in leading to salvation, is that you invite the question, I mean, I can go further than Kriya Yoga. What about ISIS? What about Al-Qaeda? Are they equally valid paths to salvation? Right? So this is a huge problem. If you don't want your religious pluralism to include religious paths which openly preach violence, killing, right? So otherwise that becomes, it's called ativyapti in Sanskrit, which is you're covering too much. You don't want to do that. That's a mistake in philosophy. So the question then is, how do Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda exclude unethical religious doctrines? And that's a very subtle question, and the answer will have to be commensurately subtle as well. But to me, I argue this in a book chapter, which in that book that I'm working on now, he has a lecture called The Necessity of Religion, where he defines religion in terms of certain fundamental doctrines. One is that it revolves around an ultimate reality. And second, it prescribes ethical and spiritual practices which help you to attain realization of that reality. So it seems to me, this is my argument also in Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality with respect to Sri Ramakrishna, that religious organizations, religious movements like ISIS or Om Shinrikyo and these other terrorist kind of religious groups, they fall foul of the second criterion. Because they're prescribing unethical practices. So in my interpretation of both Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's religious pluralism, they define religion in terms of ethical practices. That's built into the definition of religion. So if a movement prescribes unethical practices, it disqualifies itself from counting as a religion, and it's thereby excluded from their pluralist framework. That's how I see it.
If I could just add a very brief comment in agreement with what Swami Medhananda just said. In my own work recently, I haven't yet fully formed this, but I think there is a significance in the fact that in the Yoga Sutras and also the Vrats of Jainism, that ahimsa is placed before satya. That a way of living that is compassionate, that is nonviolent, is in some sense even more important than and even more of a prerequisite than having true beliefs about the nature of existence. That if we in some sense are placing ethics first, I mean, like the very fact that the yamas and the niyamas are the first of the 8 stages of yoga, that this is preliminary to even something like pranayama and asana, right? That even before you learn how to sit properly, you need to become a good human being. And I think that this affirmation of some kind of universal ethics is extremely important, because yes, otherwise, as Swami Vivekananda just said, how do we then exclude any kind of crazy, violent group that claims to be religious from our understanding of pluralism?
We have quite a couple of important questions. So what I suggest is that I'll read out all the questions together. And if you think you can condense your answers, because some of the questions are related. So there's one question from Prachi. This is a question directed to Maharaj. The 4 Vedantic paths, do they form part in each religion? Second, explaining religions with these 4 Vedantic paths or 3 model theory. I mean, the question is not complete, but whatever. Then Kanchan has one more question. Do you see a difference in the approaches of Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna as far as religious pluralism is concerned? Then there's a question from Samir Kumar Dasgupta. What is the universal religion according to Swami Vivekananda? Now, each of this question demands a half-an-hour talk. Anyway, then there's a comment from Durgesh Mishra. Communication promotion is the only channel, what I think. I mean, this is about how to create more awareness. So people can read up the comment in the chat box. Then Srilekha Banerjee had a question. Just want to ask, in today's scenario, how we can use Swamiji's teachings to subdue religious fundamentalism, something like that, and how to inculcate among people the need for knowing their real self when all kinds of crises are going on. What is religious cosmopolitanism? How is it related to secularism and spirituality beyond religions? This is Varsha's question. So you can see the questions, Maharaj. So you answer at your discretion. We have, I think, 5 to 6 more minutes just for the answers of the question. And I think these are the last questions that we'll take today.
Okay, I'll address the ones that I understand. So the first one I didn't understand from Prachi. I'm not quite sure what she's asking. So since we have limited time, I'll skip to the next one, which is a huge question from Kanchan. Do you see any differences in the approaches of Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna as far as religious pluralism is concerned? With regard to my understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism, please read chapters 3 and 4 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. And then you can compare it with my interpretation of Swami Vivekananda's views on religious pluralism in the recently published article. One of the, I'll just say very, very briefly, that it seems to me that one of the differences might be, but it's just difference really in kind of emphasis in emphasis rather than in substance, is this, that Swami Vivekananda really explicitly grounds the harmony of religions in the framework of the 4 yogas in a way that I don't think Sri Ramakrishna does. Sri Ramakrishna often says that the 4 yogas are direct and independent paths to moksha. He also says Jatamat Tatapat and Anantamat Anantapat. He says that different religious paths are paths to the same goal. But he doesn't make the conceptual connection between them that Swami Vivekananda explicitly does by claiming that each religion corresponds to one of the 4 yogas. So that conceptual link, I think, is explicitly missing from Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, but you can easily, I think it's implicit, and I think what Swami Vivekananda does is he makes what's implicit in Sri Ramakrishna's thinking explicit. And the only other one I wanted to address briefly is, what is the universal religion according to Swami Vivekananda? That's a great question. And again, I discussed this in great detail, not in my religions article, but in the book chapter that hasn't been published yet. But I'll briefly say this. It seems to me, actually, I did a very abbreviated summary of my chapter in the talk today, and I only mentioned 2 phases, but I actually think that there are 3 phases in the development of Swami Vivekananda's views. The first view is dated from September 11th, 1893 up through May 1894, or September 1894. That's what I consider the first phase. And in the first phase, if you'll notice, if you look at his paper on Hinduism, that really famous paper in the Parliament of Religions, he brings up the universal religion for the first time. It's his very first talk, right? There, he projects the universal religion as an ideal rather than as a realized actuality. And that's very significant, it seems to me. He talks about an ideal of universal religion which does not yet obtain in this world. In the second phase, which, as I said, was this Advaita inclusivist phase, he no longer says that the universal religion is a kind of pipe dream or an ideal, but it's actually here already. How is it here? It's here in the form of the 3 stages of Vedanta. The Advaitic hierarchy. Dvaita leads to Vishtadvaita, Vishtadvaita leads to Advaita. I think he held for a period of 9 months between September 1894 and May 1895 the view that the Vedantic universal religion just is the three stages of Vedanta, Dvaita, Svishta, Dvaita, Advaita. But my claim is that starting in May 1895, all the way up to his death, he reconceptualizes the nature of that Vedantic universal religion. He shifts away from understanding the universal religion in terms of the three stages of Vedanta, and reconceptualizes it in terms of the four yogas. So that universal religion becomes the four yogas, each of which is a direct and independent path to salvation. Each of the world religions corresponds to one of the yogas, and therefore every world religion is equally equipped to lead to salvation. Thanks, Jeff.
So I think you've answered, as I understood it, Prachi's question also, that the elements of the four yogas are in all the religions, and that this really is Swamiji's mature model, that that sort of tripartite Vedantic model was something he eventually abandoned for this broader idea based on the four yogas. And that's my understanding as well. I have a favorite quote of Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan where he says, Vedanta is not a religion, it is religion itself in its highest essence. And this is sort of my understanding of Swamiji's ideal of universal religion also, that it's not something we can identify with any specific ism, but as you said also, it is present. It's present everywhere that people are achieving enlightenment, achieving salvation, and following these paths and achieving their goal.
Yeah, I think just to build on that one sentence, I mean, when Vivekananda is asked about what is Vedanta, he says it's the rationale of all religions. So Arpita Mitra earlier, she talked about a meta-religion, but I think that's another way of, a universal religion in Vivekananda's eyes is a meta-religion, or the rationale of all religions, the underlying framework of all religions, that explains how they can all be salvifically effective.
And it was definitely not an idea of one religion sort of dominating all others. He explicitly rejects that.
I think Varsha's question is also very important, but maybe she can take it up with you later. Or do you want to answer it now?
It seems like a big question. It's a good question.
Yeah, so maybe she can take it up with you later. Before concluding the session, so I thank both the panelists today for such a vibrant discussion and debate. I'm sure everybody found it of interest. Before concluding the session, I would like to make a small announcement that those of you, we will be in VSC JNU will be holding public webinars for the next few weeks. If you wish to receive information about the same, just leave a message at our Gmail ID, vscjnu@gmail.com, so that we can intimate you about our upcoming programs. Now I hand over the mic to Amrita because we'll finish with chanting and all. So I request you to stay back till then. Thank you.
Now, I would request Dr. Prachi Singh to propose the vote of thanks and also conclude today's meeting with the recital of Shanti Mantra of Isha Upanishad. So, Prachi.
Thank you, Amrita. On behalf of VSC JNU, I extend my gratitude to our speakers, Professor Jeffery Long and Swami Medhananda, for enlightening us. We are deeply thankful, sir, for taking out the time to deliver a talk. I am thankful to all our participants who have joined today's discussion. Your presence in large is motivating for us. I am thankful to all the members of the VSC JNU, namely Ms. Alka, Namrata, Amrita, Arun, Anindita Didi, Dr. Priya, Srilekha, Tanushri Didi, Rishi, Shilpa, for their constant inputs and suggestions at every step. Their constant hard work has turned this day into a success. I extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Arpita Mitra for coordinating with the speakers and for guiding us at every step for the program. I also extend my special thanks to Swagata Didi, who took her time out from the busy schedule in preparing logos, flyers for the VSC JNU. And I would also like to thank Professor Anirban Chakravarti, who has served as the foundation for the entire event. His calm approach, in-season guidance, and yet silent work is a great motivation towards the success of the event. Before we bring this program to the close, I would like to make an announcement. On 29th August, we are honored to have Swami Pitambaranandji amidst us. He will give a talk on the mind and its control. So the links will be shared accordingly. So now we bring the session to an end with a Shanti mantra. Thank you everyone for joining us. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayah Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschit Dukh Bhag Bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you everyone for joining us.